And sometimes the greatest fear in your life has nothing to do with being alone. It has everything to do with believing that if someone truly sees who you are, they will eventually leave. Not because you aren't kind enough, not because you aren't loving enough, but because somewhere deep inside you, a silent conclusion was written long before you ever had the chance to question it. People don't stay. That belief can shape an entire life without ever speaking its name. It can make you overthink a simple text message. It can convince you that distance means rejection. It can turn love into vigilance instead of peace. And perhaps most painfully, it can make you abandon yourself long before anyone else has the chance to. Most people think the fear of abandonment is about losing other people. It isn't. It's about losing your sense of safety whenever connection feels uncertain. That difference changes everything. Because if the problem isn't other people, then the solution isn't finding someone who promises never to leave. The solution is becoming someone who no longer disappears from themselves whenever life becomes emotionally uncertain. That is what this journey is really about. Not becoming less loving, not becoming emotionally distant, but becoming emotionally secure. There is a quiet kind of freedom waiting on the other side of this fear. A freedom that doesn't depend on perfect relationships or constant reassurance. A freedom that allows you to love deeply without constantly preparing for loss. And before we're finished, you'll begin to understand why the fear you've carried for so long was never proof that something was wrong with you. It was evidence that somewhere along the way, your nervous system learned to confuse uncertainty with danger. Once you see that clearly, the entire pattern begins to loosen. Because healing doesn't begin when people finally stop leaving. Healing begins when their leaving no longer determines your worth. That is where everything changes. The fear of abandonment rarely announces itself. It doesn't walk into your life wearing a name tag. Instead, it disguises itself as personality. You call yourself an overthinker, a people pleaser, someone who simply loves deeply, someone who needs communication, someone who's just anxious. Sometimes those descriptions are true, but sometimes they are simply different faces of the same hidden fear. The fear that says, if I stop earning love, I will lose it. Listen carefully to that sentence, because almost every unhealthy relationship begins there. Not with love, with fear. Real love invites authenticity. Fear demands performance. And when fear becomes the foundation, every interaction slowly transforms into emotional labor. You become hyper-aware of other people's moods. You study tiny changes in their voice. You replay conversations in your head. You apologize before anyone says you're wrong. You anticipate rejection before rejection even exists. Your mind becomes a full-time detective searching for evidence that someone is about to leave. The exhausting part isn't the relationships. It's the constant surveillance. That surveillance consumes enormous emotional energy. And here's what most people never realize. The brain isn't designed to distinguish perfectly between physical danger and social rejection. Thousands of years ago, exclusion from the tribe often meant death. Being alone wasn't merely painful. It was dangerous. Your nervous system still carries echoes of that ancient programming. That's why a delayed reply can trigger an emotional reaction completely disproportionate to the event itself. Logically, you know they may simply be busy. Emotionally, your body whispers something entirely different. This is how it starts. That whisper doesn't come from the present. It comes from memory. Not conscious memory. Emotional memory. The kind stored beneath language, beneath logic, beneath awareness. And this is where healing becomes more compassionate than most advice you'll ever hear. Because you are not irrational. You are responding exactly as a nervous system trained by uncertainty would respond. That's an important distinction. Your reactions make sense. They simply no longer serve the life you're trying to build. That realization removes shame without removing responsibility. And that's the balance that creates real transformation. Not self-blame, not self-pity, understanding, because understanding calms the mind. Shame only keeps it trapped. Think back, not necessarily to one dramatic event, but to the emotional atmosphere in which you learned what love meant. Some people grew up with obvious abandonment. A parent left. Someone died. A caregiver disappeared. Those wounds are visible. But many others experienced something far quieter. Love that was unpredictable. Affection that depended on achievement. Attention that appeared one day and vanished the next. Parents who were physically present but emotionally unavailable. Homes where emotions felt unsafe. No one may have intended harm, yet the child learned something profound. Connection isn't stable. Children never blame the adults they depend on. They blame themselves. That is one of childhood's most heartbreaking adaptations. If love feels inconsistent, a child doesn't conclude, "My caregivers are overwhelmed." Instead, they conclude, "Something about me isn't enough." That belief becomes invisible because it forms before critical thinking develops. It settles beneath identity, and eventually it sounds like your own voice. I'm too much. I'm not enough. I always ruin relationships. They'll get tired of me. I have to try harder. Notice something. None of these statements describe reality. They describe survival. There is a difference. Survival tells stories that keep you alert. Healing questions whether those stories are still true. That is the beginning of freedom. Not instantly believing something positive, simply becoming willing to question something negative. That tiny shift can change the direction of an entire life. Now here's where most people get stuck. They assume healing means becoming independent enough to stop needing anyone. But that's not security. That's protection. There's a profound difference. The fear of abandonment often creates two opposite strategies. Some people cling tightly. Others never get close enough to be left. One pursues relentlessly. The other withdraws entirely. One constantly asks, "Do you still love me?" The other quietly decides, "I'll leave first." Different behaviors. Same fear. One reaches outward. The other builds walls. Both are trying to solve the same emotional equation. How do I avoid being hurt again? Here's the tragedy. The very behaviors designed to prevent abandonment often create the emotional distance they fear most. When someone constantly seeks reassurance, their partner may begin feeling responsible for emotions they cannot permanently regulate. When someone refuses vulnerability, their partner may feel shut out. Neither person is trying to sabotage love. They're trying to survive it. That changes how we judge ourselves. And it changes how we judge others. Because beneath almost every difficult attachment pattern is an attempt to protect a younger version of ourselves who once believed that love could disappear without warning. The child inside you isn't manipulative. They are frightened. And frightened people don't need criticism. They need safety. But here comes the deeper insight. Adult safety cannot depend entirely on another adult. If it does, your peace will always be rented instead of owned. That is the trap. Security borrowed from someone else can disappear whenever their mood changes, their schedule shifts, or life becomes complicated. Real emotional security is different. It allows connection without emotional captivity. It allows closeness without constant fear. It allows love without making another person responsible for your identity. And the next step toward that freedom begins with something most people have never been taught. Because healing your fear of abandonment is not primarily about changing your relationships. It's about changing your relationship with the frightened voice that still lives inside you. And once you truly understand that voice, you stop fighting yourself. You finally begin leading yourself. The voice inside you is rarely trying to ruin your life. It is trying to protect it. That may sound strange at first. After all, if this fear causes overthinking, anxiety, people-pleasing, emotional exhaustion, and relationships that leave you drained, how could it possibly be protective? Because the mind is less concerned with making you happy than with keeping you safe. And safety is often defined by familiarity, even when familiarity hurts. This is one of the greatest psychological paradoxes you'll ever encounter. Your nervous system does not automatically choose what is healthy. It chooses what it recognizes. That is why someone who grew up around emotional unpredictability may feel strangely drawn to emotionally unpredictable people. Not because chaos feels good, because chaos feels familiar. The body quietly whispers, "I've been here before. I know how to survive this." Meanwhile, calm can feel confusing. Consistency can feel suspicious. Healthy love can even feel boring. Not because it lacks passion, because it lacks the emotional roller coaster your nervous system mistakenly learned to associate with intimacy. That realization changes how you see your past. Perhaps you didn't repeatedly choose the wrong people because you lacked wisdom. Perhaps you chose what your nervous system believed was home. There is no shame in that, only awareness. And awareness is where every lasting transformation begins. Because once you can name a pattern, you are no longer trapped inside it. You can finally step outside it. One of the quietest symptoms of abandonment fear is something most people never notice. It isn't panic. It isn't crying. It isn't even insecurity. It's self-abandonment. This is where the wound becomes almost invisible. You stop asking, "What do I feel?" And you begin asking, "What do they need from me?" You stop expressing disagreement because conflict feels dangerous. You become agreeable, flexible, easygoing, understanding. You tell yourself you're simply being kind. Sometimes you are. But sometimes kindness becomes camouflage. A way of protecting the relationship by slowly disappearing inside it. You laugh at jokes that hurt. You accept behavior that leaves you empty. You ignore your intuition. You silence your needs. You become fluent in everyone else's emotions while slowly forgetting your own. And one day, you wake up emotionally exhausted without understanding why. The exhaustion isn't coming from loving too much. It's coming from editing yourself every single day. Imagine carrying a heavy backpack for years. Eventually, you stop noticing the weight. Not because it became lighter, because your body adapted. Self-abandonment works the same way. You become so accustomed to abandoning your own needs that it begins to feel normal. Until someone asks a simple question, "What do you want?" And you genuinely don't know. That moment is painful, but it is also quietly hopeful. Because confusion often appears right before rediscovery. Sometimes not knowing who you are simply means you've spent too long becoming who you thought you had to be. Healing begins when you slowly return to yourself. Not dramatically, quietly, one honest choice at a time. Now here's something that surprises almost everyone. People with abandonment wounds often become exceptionally caring, empathetic, compassionate, generous. They sense emotional shifts before anyone else notices. They remember birthdays. They notice when someone seems quieter than usual. They instinctively know how to comfort others. These qualities are beautiful. The problem isn't the empathy. The problem is when empathy becomes hypervigilance, when caring becomes monitoring, when compassion becomes a form of control. You begin believing that everyone else's emotional state is somehow yours to manage. If they're upset, you search for what you did wrong. If they're distant, you assume you caused it. If they're stressed, you carry the stress alongside them. Slowly, without realizing it, your emotional limits dissolve. You become emotionally available to everyone except yourself. Here's the truth that changes everything. Compassion does not require emotional absorption. You can love someone deeply without carrying emotions that aren't yours. You can support someone without becoming responsible for saving them. You can stand beside someone without losing your own footing. Healthy love doesn't ask you to disappear. Healthy love allows two whole people to walk together, not one person carrying both lives. That distinction is subtle, but life-changing. Because emotional maturity isn't measured by how much pain you can tolerate. It's measured by how connected you remain to yourself while loving others. That's real strength, not sacrifice. Presence. There is another illusion that keeps abandonment wounds alive. The belief that certainty creates security. You think, if they would just reassure me one more time, if they would communicate perfectly, if they would promise they'll never leave, then I'll finally be able to relax. But certainty has a strange habit. The moment you receive it, the fear asks for more. One reassuring message becomes two. Two become five. Five become constant checking, not because reassurance doesn't help. Because reassurance cannot heal a wound created inside your own nervous system. It can comfort you temporarily. It cannot permanently rewrite beliefs you've carried for years. This is why people sometimes receive extraordinary love and still feel afraid. Their partner changes. Their circumstances improve. Their life becomes healthier. But the anxiety remains because the environment changed. The internal blueprint didn't. Healing means updating the blueprint, not endlessly changing the people around you. That's where your real power lives, because people will always be imperfect. Communication will sometimes fail. Life will sometimes separate you from those you love. None of that has to destroy your inner stability. When your security comes from within, uncertainty becomes uncomfortable instead of catastrophic. That is enormous progress, because life doesn't promise certainty. It offers resilience, and resilience is far more valuable. Stay with me, because this next idea is where many people finally begin to breathe differently. Imagine your emotional world as a house. For years, you've stood at the front window watching the street. Every passing person captures your attention. Who's arriving? Who's leaving? Who hasn't called? Who seems distant? Every movement outside determines how you feel inside. Your emotional life becomes controlled by external traffic. Healing doesn't mean pretending people don't matter. It means finally walking away from the window. It means discovering that there is an entire home you've never explored. A quiet room where your values live. Another where your dreams have been waiting patiently. A room filled with creativity. One filled with curiosity. Another holding grief you've never fully allowed yourself to feel. And deep inside that house, a room containing the younger version of you who has spent years believing they were alone. Most people spend their lives standing at the window. Few ever walk through the house. But when you do, something remarkable happens. The people outside are still important. You still love. You still connect. You still experience loss. But they no longer define the architecture of your inner world. Because you have finally become familiar with your own home. That's emotional security. Not isolation. Inner residence. You stop living at the mercy of who comes and goes. You finally learn how to stay. With yourself. And perhaps that is the deepest form of loyalty any human being can experience. Not loyalty to an image, not loyalty to perfection, but loyalty to your own humanity. Here's something worth sitting with. The opposite of abandonment is not attachment. The opposite of abandonment is presence. Think about that for a moment. Someone can stay physically close to you while remaining emotionally absent. And someone can leave your life while the love they gave continues shaping you forever. Presence has never been measured by distance. It has always been measured by attention. The most important presence you will ever experience is your own. When difficult emotions appear, do you stay with yourself? Or do you immediately judge yourself? When fear rises, do you become curious? Or do you try to silence it? When loneliness visits, do you offer yourself compassion or criticism? These moments matter more than you realize. Because every time you remain emotionally present with yourself, instead of abandoning your own experience, you teach your nervous system something entirely new. I'm not alone anymore. Not because another person arrived, because you did. That is how old wounds begin to lose their authority, not through force, through repetition. Every small act of self-trust becomes another brick in a foundation that fear can no longer shake. And once that foundation becomes strong enough, relationships stop feeling like rescue missions. They become shared journeys between two emotionally grounded people. That changes everything. There comes a moment in every genuine healing journey when you realize something that feels both unsettling and liberating. The fear you've been fighting isn't actually living in the present. It's living in your predictions about the future. Notice how rarely abandonment fear speaks in the language of now. It doesn't say, right now, I'm safe. It says, what if they change? What if they stop loving me? What if I become too much? What if this happiness doesn't last? The mind keeps reaching forward, searching for a future pain it hopes to prevent. At first, this seems intelligent. If you anticipate rejection early enough, perhaps it won't hurt as much. But that's the illusion. Anticipation doesn't reduce pain, it extends it. You begin grieving losses that haven't happened. You defend yourself against conversations that never take place. You prepare for endings that may never come. Little by little, the present moment becomes occupied by imagined futures. That is one of the hidden costs of abandonment fear. It steals today's peace to pay for tomorrow's uncertainty. And tomorrow never arrives the way anxiety imagined. Because anxiety is rarely a prophet. It's a protector. An overworked protector. One that keeps sounding an alarm long after the danger has passed. That distinction matters. Because you don't heal by arguing with the alarm. You heal by showing the nervous system that the house is no longer on fire. That's a very different conversation. Most people believe confidence comes from certainty. Psychology suggests something far more interesting. Confidence grows from surviving uncertainty. Think back to every meaningful relationship you've admired. Not the perfect ones, the healthy ones. They weren't built because two people eliminated all uncertainty. They were built because two people learned they could tolerate uncertainty without destroying the relationship. Trust has never meant knowing everything. Trust means remaining open without demanding guarantees. That's why secure people still experience moments of doubt. They simply don't build their identity around those moments. An insecure thought arrives. It stays for a while. Then it leaves. A fearful mind believes every thought deserves a trial. A secure mind understands that not every thought deserves a verdict. That is emotional wisdom. Not believing everything your fear says simply because it speaks with conviction. Fear has always been persuasive. That doesn't make it truthful. Imagine clouds drifting across the sky. Some are bright, some are dark, some carry rain, others disappear within minutes. Your thoughts work the same way. Yet abandonment fear encourages you to climb inside every cloud as though it were your permanent home. Healing teaches something radically different. Observe the cloud. You don't have to live inside it. That single shift creates extraordinary freedom. Because awareness gives you space, and space gives you choice. That is where emotional maturity begins. Not controlling every thought. Choosing which thoughts deserve your attention. The difference is profound. Now let's explore something that quietly shapes almost every relationship. The stories you tell yourself between interactions. Someone you love seems distracted. Objectively, that's all you know. But your mind doesn't stop there. It immediately begins writing a story. They're losing interest. They're upset with me. I've done something wrong. Within minutes, a simple observation becomes a complete narrative. What's remarkable is how quickly the body believes the story. Your heart races. Your muscles tighten. Sleep becomes difficult. Not because of what actually happened, because of what your mind imagined. This happens so automatically that most people mistake interpretation for reality. But there is a question that emotionally secure people ask far more often. What else could be true? Maybe they're overwhelmed at work. Maybe they're exhausted. Maybe they're processing something they haven't shared yet. Maybe nothing is wrong at all. The goal isn't forced optimism. The goal is flexibility. Fear tells one story. Wisdom considers several. That flexibility creates emotional breathing room. Without it, every uncertainty becomes a personal threat. With it, curiosity begins replacing catastrophe. Because curiosity keeps relationships open. Catastrophizing quietly closes them. That is why emotionally secure people often appear calmer. Not because they have fewer problems, because they create fewer unnecessary stories. And stories, more than circumstances, shape emotional experience. There is another layer beneath abandonment fear that deserves careful attention. Control. Not obvious control. Subtle control. The kind that hides behind good intentions. Checking repeatedly to make sure everything is okay. Analyzing every conversation. Trying to become the perfect partner. Avoiding mistakes at all costs. Managing everyone's emotions. Predicting every possible conflict before it arrives. At first glance, these behaviors seem loving, but underneath them lies a quiet belief. If I can control enough variables, I can prevent abandonment. It's understandable. After all, uncertainty once felt dangerous. Control became medicine. Unfortunately, medicine can become dependency. Because life refuses to cooperate with perfect control. People change. Plans change. Health changes. Jobs change. Seasons change. Even love evolves. Trying to freeze life in place is like trying to hold water with closed fists. The tighter you squeeze, the less remains. That's the paradox. Control often creates the very instability it was designed to prevent. Because relationships need space to breathe, not surveillance. Real intimacy requires freedom, not perfection. This doesn't mean becoming careless. It means recognizing where your responsibility ends. You are responsible for your honesty, your kindness, your limits, your growth. You are not responsible for controlling another person's heart. That realization feels terrifying at first. Then it becomes deeply peaceful. Because carrying responsibility that never belonged to you is exhausting. Setting it down isn't giving up. It's growing up. There's a difference. But here is where the conversation becomes even more important. Many people believe healing means becoming fearless. It doesn't. Fearlessness is unnecessary. Courage is enough. There will still be days when uncertainty returns. Old memories may still whisper familiar stories. Certain situations may activate parts of you that haven't fully healed yet. That doesn't mean you've failed. It means you're human. The healing isn't measured by the absence of triggers. It's measured by how quickly you return to yourself after being triggered. Years ago, a delayed message might have ruined your entire week. Now perhaps it affects your afternoon. Later, maybe only a few minutes. Eventually, you notice the fear. You breathe. And instead of obeying it, you thank it for trying to protect you. Then you continue living your life. That is extraordinary progress. Not because fear disappeared. Because it stopped becoming your leader. There is tremendous freedom in realizing that emotions are visitors, not dictators. They knock. They don't own the house. That perspective quietly changes everything. Because every emotion becomes information rather than instruction. Fear says, something feels unsafe. Wisdom asks, is it truly unsafe or simply unfamiliar? Those two questions create completely different lives. One remains trapped inside old conditioning. The other begins building a future that isn't dictated by the past. And that's where genuine transformation begins. Not when life becomes predictable. When you become steady. Steadiness is one of the most misunderstood forms of strength. It isn't loud. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't prove itself through dramatic displays of confidence. In fact, truly secure people often appear almost ordinary. They don't seem extraordinary because they are no longer spending energy trying to convince anyone, including themselves, that they are enough. They simply live from that place. That quiet confidence changes everything. Think about the people who make you feel the safest. Chances are, it isn't because they always know the right thing to say. It isn't because they're perfect. It's because they are emotionally consistent. They don't become a completely different person when conflict appears. They don't withdraw affection as punishment. They don't make you earn your place every single day. Their presence tells your nervous system something words cannot. You don't have to perform to belong here. Now imagine becoming that kind of presence for yourself. That is one of the deepest forms of healing. Because many people spend years searching for someone who can provide a feeling they have never learned to give themselves. And no relationship, no matter how loving, can permanently replace an inner foundation. It can support it. It can strengthen it, but it cannot become it. That realization is not discouraging. It is empowering. Because it returns the most important part of your healing to the one person who has always been with you. You. One of the greatest turning points in overcoming abandonment fear is learning to separate discomfort from danger. Your nervous system doesn't always make that distinction automatically. Someone asks for space. Your body reacts as if the relationship is ending. Someone is quieter than usual. Your chest tightens before you've learned any facts. Someone disagrees with you. Your mind immediately searches for signs of rejection. The emotional response is real, but real does not always mean accurate. This is where emotional intelligence becomes practical. Instead of asking, "Why do I feel this?" try asking, "What is my nervous system trying to protect me from?" That small shift replaces judgment with curiosity. Instead of fighting yourself, you begin listening to yourself. And what you'll often discover is surprisingly simple. The frightened part of you isn't asking for perfection. It is asking for reassurance that you won't abandon yourself if someone else disappoints you. Read that again. Because it may be the most important sentence in this entire conversation. The deepest promise you can make isn't, "No one will ever leave me." You cannot promise that. Life doesn't allow it. People move. Relationships change. Loss is part of being human. The promise that changes everything is this: whatever happens, I won't leave myself. That promise transforms the entire emotional landscape. Because your greatest source of safety is no longer external, it becomes internal. And internal safety travels with you wherever you go. This is why limits are so essential. Many people misunderstand them. They think limits push people away. Healthy limits actually make closeness possible. Imagine trying to build a beautiful home without walls. Everything enters. Nothing is protected. Eventually, the home becomes unlivable. Relationships work the same way. Without limits, resentment quietly replaces intimacy. You say yes when your heart says no. You tolerate behavior that slowly erodes your self-respect. You convince yourself that keeping the peace is more important than telling the truth. At first, it feels like love. Eventually, it feels like exhaustion. That isn't because limits create distance. It's because the absence of limits creates self-betrayal. Every time you ignore your own values to avoid rejection, you send yourself a silent message. My needs matter less than keeping someone close. Repeat that often enough, and self-worth begins to erode. Not all at once. One compromise at a time. Healing asks something radically different. It asks you to tell the truth with kindness. To disappoint others when necessary instead of disappointing yourself every day. That can feel terrifying if you've spent years believing love depends on pleasing everyone around you. But here's what slowly becomes clear. The people who only stay when you have no limits were never attached to the real you. They were attached to your accommodation. Healthy relationships survive honest limits. Unhealthy ones often resist them. Not because limits create problems, because they reveal them. That revelation is painful, but it is also profoundly freeing. Because clarity, even when uncomfortable, is always kinder than illusion. There is another habit that quietly keeps abandonment wounds alive. Comparison. You compare your relationship to someone else's. You compare your healing to another person's progress. You compare the attention you receive to the attention someone else receives. Comparison always asks one question. Am I enough? It rarely finds a satisfying answer. Because comparison has no finish line. There will always be someone receiving more affection. Someone with a happier relationship. Someone who appears more confident. Someone who seems impossible to reject. The mind keeps moving the target. But worth was never meant to be measured against another human being. Worth isn't competitive. It is intrinsic. A sunrise doesn't become less beautiful because another sunrise exists. A tree doesn't question its value because another tree grew taller. Nature never competes for permission to exist. It simply expresses itself. Human beings begin suffering the moment they forget this. You were never asked to become someone else's version of lovable. You were asked to become more fully yourself. That is enough. More than enough. The irony is that authenticity often creates the connection people spend years trying to manufacture through perfection. People trust honesty. They relax around authenticity. Perfection, on the other hand, creates distance. Because perfection is impossible to relate to. Your humanity is far more magnetic than your performance. Always remember that. Perhaps you've noticed something throughout this journey. We haven't spent much time talking about changing other people. That wasn't an accident. The greatest shift in healing abandonment fear happens when your attention gradually returns to the only life you can truly shape. Your own. Instead of asking, will they choose me? You begin asking, am I choosing a life that reflects my values? Instead of wondering, what if they leave? You begin wondering, am I staying connected to myself? Instead of constantly asking, how do I keep this relationship? You begin asking, how do I become someone who creates healthy relationships naturally? Notice the direction of those questions. Outward becomes inward. Fear becomes responsibility. Reaction becomes intention. This is not selfishness. It is maturity. Because people who know themselves don't need to manipulate love. They recognize it. They participate in it. They contribute to it. But they no longer sacrifice themselves to preserve it. That is the quiet confidence of emotional security. Not needing to chase. Not needing to hide. Simply showing up as the fullest version of yourself. Before we reach the final chapter, there is one last idea worth carrying with you. Many people ask, how long does healing take? It's a reasonable question. But perhaps there is a better one. Who am I becoming while I heal? Because healing is not simply the removal of pain. It is the construction of character. Every moment you choose self-respect over self-abandonment, you become someone new. Every honest conversation you once would have avoided, you become someone new. Every time you allow uncertainty without surrendering to panic, you become someone new. These moments may seem small. Individually, they hardly feel dramatic. But identity is never transformed in one grand event. It is shaped through thousands of ordinary decisions. Quiet decisions, invisible decisions, the kind no one applauds, the kind only you know you made. Those are the decisions that build an unshakable life. Because one day you'll look back and realize something remarkable. The fear that once controlled every relationship no longer recognizes the person you've become. There is a quiet moment that arrives in every genuine healing journey. It doesn't announce itself. There are no fireworks, no dramatic breakthrough, no single morning where you wake up completely transformed. Instead, something almost unnoticeable begins to happen. The situations that once consumed you start losing their grip. A delayed reply still catches your attention, but not your entire day. Someone else's bad mood no longer becomes your responsibility. Silence no longer feels like evidence. You stop needing immediate answers for every uncertainty. At first, these changes seem insignificant, but they aren't. They are evidence that your nervous system is beginning to trust something it never trusted before. You. For years, your emotional stability may have depended on external confirmation, someone else's affection, someone else's approval, someone else's presence. Now, little by little, your inner world begins generating its own stability. That is one of the greatest psychological shifts a human being can experience, because dependence slowly gives way to self-trust. And self-trust changes everything. People often believe that secure attachment means becoming fearless. But if you spend time with emotionally healthy people, you'll notice something different. They still feel disappointment. They still experience grief. They still wonder where they stand sometimes. The difference is not what they feel. The difference is what they believe. When conflict appears, they don't immediately conclude, "I'm about to lose everything." When someone needs space, they don't immediately conclude, "I'm no longer lovable." When a relationship ends, they grieve the loss without turning it into a verdict about their worth. That is emotional security, not emotional numbness. There is a profound distinction between pain and identity. Pain says, "This hurts." Fear says, "This defines me." Healing quietly separates those two experiences. You begin understanding that rejection is an event, not an identity. Disappointment is an experience, not a personality. Loss is part of life, not proof that you are unworthy of love. These distinctions sound simple, but they reshape an entire life. Because every healthy relationship is built by people who know the difference between what happened and who they are. That difference protects your peace. One day, you may discover something surprising. You no longer feel compelled to convince everyone to stay. That old urgency begins fading, not because you care less, because you trust more. You trust that genuine connection cannot be manufactured through performance. It cannot be negotiated through anxiety. It cannot be secured through constant self-sacrifice. Healthy love has never required you to become smaller. It has only ever asked you to become more honest. Imagine meeting someone while carrying no hidden agenda. You're not trying to impress them. You're not trying to prevent future rejection. You're not silently asking, "Please choose me." Instead, you're simply asking, "Are we genuinely good for each other?" That question changes everything. Notice how balanced it is. It doesn't place one person above the other. It recognizes that compatibility matters. Mutual respect matters. Shared values matter. Emotional availability matters. When abandonment fear is active, every relationship feels like an audition. When healing begins, relationships become conversations. That shift is extraordinary, because auditions require pretending. Conversations invite authenticity. Authenticity creates peace, and peace is impossible to fake. There is another transformation that often goes unnoticed. You stop chasing closure from people who are unable to provide it. For years, perhaps you believed that if someone could finally explain why they hurt you, if they apologized perfectly, if they truly admitted what they did, then you could finally move on. Sometimes that happens. Often it doesn't. Waiting for someone else's awareness can quietly postpone your own healing. Because closure is not always something another person gives you. Sometimes it is something you create. Not by pretending the pain didn't matter. Not by excusing harmful behavior. But by refusing to let someone else's limitations determine the rest of your story. Think about how much emotional energy people spend asking questions that have no satisfying answers. Why wasn't I enough? Why did they change? Why couldn't they love me the way I loved them? These questions are understandable. But notice where they point. Always outward. Healing eventually asks different questions. What did this teach me? What will I carry forward? How do I love without abandoning myself again? Those questions return your power. Not because they erase the past, because they help create a wiser future. That is the difference. One of the most profound truths about abandonment is this. The people who hurt you often taught you what fear feels like. But they do not get to decide what love means for the rest of your life. That choice belongs to you. You are allowed to redefine love. Perhaps love used to mean anxiety. Now it can mean peace. Perhaps love used to mean proving yourself. Now it can mean authenticity. Perhaps love used to mean walking on eggshells. Now it can mean emotional safety. Perhaps love once meant surviving. Now it can mean growing. This is more than positive thinking. It is psychological reconstruction. You are replacing old definitions with healthier ones. And here's what makes this possible. The brain continues changing throughout life. Neuroscientists call this neuroplasticity. But long before science gave it a name, human beings had already discovered its truth. People can change, not instantly, not effortlessly, but deeply. Each time you experience a healthy interaction and allow yourself to receive it instead of distrusting it, your brain learns. Each time you set a limit and survive it, your brain learns. Each time you comfort yourself instead of criticizing yourself, your brain learns. Healing is not one dramatic revelation. It is thousands of small repetitions teaching your nervous system a new definition of safety. That is why patience matters. Because repetition rewires what intensity never could. There is one final trap that often appears near the end of healing. The belief that you must become perfect before you deserve healthy love. That belief sounds noble. It isn't. It's simply perfectionism wearing new clothes. You don't need to eliminate every insecurity before entering meaningful relationships. You don't need to heal every wound before becoming worthy of connection. No human being reaches that destination. Growth is lifelong. Emotionally secure people still have insecurities. They simply refuse to organize their entire identity around them. And they don't wait until they're flawless before allowing themselves to be loved. They allow healthy love to become part of their continued growth. There is wisdom in that, because relationships don't merely reveal our wounds. Healthy ones also become places where healing continues, not because another person fixes us, because safe connection allows parts of ourselves to finally relax. Healing doesn't happen in isolation alone. It also happens in relationships built on honesty, consistency, and mutual respect. That realization removes an enormous amount of pressure. You don't have to become perfect. You simply have to become willing. Willing to tell the truth. Willing to remain present. Willing to keep returning to yourself whenever fear tries to pull you away. That willingness is enough. More than enough. Because transformation has never belonged to the perfect. It has always belonged to the persistent. There is a sentence that quietly separates the life you have lived from the life you are about to begin. It is not a sentence about finding the right person. It is not a sentence about never feeling afraid again. It is not even a sentence about healing completely. It is much simpler, much quieter, and infinitely more powerful. I will not abandon myself. At first, those words may seem almost too simple. But if you truly live by them, they change everything. Because every fear of abandonment is ultimately answered by that promise. Not the promise that everyone will stay. Life has never made that promise. People will come into your life. Some will remain for decades. Others will leave after a season. Some relationships will end with gratitude. Others will end with heartbreak. Some people will misunderstand you. Some will outgrow you. Some will disappoint you. And despite your greatest efforts, there will be moments when you disappoint others. This is not failure. It is the cost of living honestly among imperfect human beings. The goal was never to create a life untouched by loss. The goal is to become someone who remains whole even when loss arrives. That is emotional freedom. Not because your heart becomes harder, because your roots become deeper. A tree does not survive storms because it controls the wind. It survives because its roots have learned how to hold. Your emotional life is no different. For years, perhaps your roots reached outward, into other people's opinions, other people's consistency, other people's approval, other people's choices. Every change in their lives felt like an earthquake in yours. Now your roots begin growing somewhere new, into your own character, your own values, your own integrity, your own compassion, your own capacity to remain present with yourself. And roots that grow inward cannot be taken away by someone walking out the door. That is the quiet strength you've been searching for. Not certainty, groundedness. Imagine meeting the younger version of yourself, the child, the teenager, the young adult, the version of you who first learned that love could disappear. Look into their eyes for a moment. Notice how alert they are, how carefully they watch people's expressions, how quickly they apologize, how desperately they try to earn belonging. Notice how exhausted they look, not because they lacked love, because they believed love could vanish at any moment. That younger version of you carried an impossible responsibility: to predict every rejection, to prevent every goodbye, to become so perfect that no one would ever leave. No child could carry that weight. No adult can either. If you could speak to that younger self today, perhaps you wouldn't offer complicated advice. Perhaps you would simply kneel beside them and say, "You never had to earn the right to exist. You never had to become perfect to deserve love. None of this was proof that something was wrong with you. You adapted because you were trying to survive. Thank you for protecting us. I'll take it from here." Those last words matter. I'll take it from here. Because healing is not rejecting the frightened parts of yourself. It is becoming the adult they have been waiting for. Not the perfect adult, the present one, the compassionate one, the one who no longer confuses fear with identity. The one who can say, "I know you're scared, but we don't have to live there anymore." That conversation may never happen out loud, yet it has the power to transform your entire emotional world. Perhaps the greatest surprise of healing is that your relationships change without you trying to change them. Not because everyone around you suddenly becomes healthier. Because you do. You stop chasing people who enjoy being pursued but never truly choose you. You stop confusing inconsistency with chemistry. You stop mistaking emotional intensity for emotional intimacy. You begin noticing things you once ignored: respect, consistency, kindness, emotional accountability, the ability to repair after conflict, the willingness to communicate honestly. These qualities may have seemed ordinary before. Now they become extraordinary, because your definition of love has changed. You no longer ask, "Who makes me feel the strongest emotions?" You ask, "Who allows me to feel the safest being myself?" That single question has the power to alter every relationship that follows. Because peace begins replacing performance. And peace has a quiet beauty that fear could never recognize. There will still be difficult days. Healing does not erase your humanity. There may be mornings when old thoughts return, evenings when loneliness feels heavier than usual, moments when silence awakens familiar fears. When that happens, remember this: progress is not measured by whether fear visits. It is measured by whether fear becomes your home. Visitors come and go. Homes remain. Your heart is no longer meant to be a temporary shelter for anxiety. It is becoming a permanent home for awareness, for courage, for compassion, for truth. And every time fear knocks on the door, you can greet it differently. Not with panic, not with shame, simply with understanding. I know why you're here. Thank you for trying to protect me. But you don't have to lead anymore. That is emotional mastery, not defeating fear. Outgrowing the belief that fear should make your decisions. One day, perhaps years from now, someone will enter your life. Or perhaps someone already has. And they will notice something different about you. Not because you've become more impressive, because you've become more peaceful. You no longer need constant reassurance to believe you're loved. You no longer disappear during conflict. You no longer apologize for existing. You no longer measure your worth by another person's availability. You still love deeply, perhaps even more deeply than before. But now your love is an offering, not a negotiation. It is generous without becoming self-sacrificing. It is vulnerable without becoming dependent. It is committed without becoming controlling. That is what secure love feels like. Not louder, calmer, not dramatic, steady, not desperate, free. And people often mistake that quietness for ordinary. It isn't. It is one of the rarest forms of strength a human being can develop. As this journey comes to a close, remember what brought you here. Perhaps you began believing your greatest problem was the fear that people might leave. But maybe now you can see something deeper. The greatest wound was never abandonment itself. It was the belief that someone else's departure could determine your value. That belief no longer belongs to you. Not because someone else finally convinced you otherwise, because you discovered something they could never give you in the first place. Your own presence, your own loyalty, your own unwavering commitment to remain connected to yourself. And when you carry that with you, relationships become something beautifully different. They become places where love is shared, not where identity is stored. That is the freedom you've been searching for. Not freedom from love, freedom within it. So walk forward differently. Love generously. Speak honestly. Set limits without guilt. Receive kindness without suspicion. Allow yourself to be seen without performing. Trust slowly. Forgive wisely. Leave what diminishes your spirit. Protect what nourishes it. And wherever life takes you, remember the promise that quietly transformed everything. You will not abandon yourself again. Because the moment you truly stop leaving yourself, you become the kind of person who finally feels at home. No matter who comes, no matter who goes, and that is where lasting peace begins.